The Beloved Community is an initiative that I'll talk about some in a moment, but I want to welcome you to our first Beloved Community Learning Lab. So good to have everyone join us. Each month, the Beloved Community Learning Labs are going to take a different action constellation that focuses on one of the elements of building a racially just city. And this month, our focus is on violence reduction. Last year, there were 173 deaths and 500 non fatal gunshots here in Louisville, making it one of the most violent years in our history. We've dedicated this month to a deeper understanding not only of the causes of violence, but how we as a community can eliminate violence from our city. So thanks for joining us in that effort, and hope you will think about actions that you can take based upon our conversation today, and implement those in your life and in our community. And today we'll be having a conversation with Monique Williams. Monique was the director of Youth Violence Prevention Research Center, and she still works there at the University of Louisville. And she's now also the director of the Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods. So, Monique, thanks for being with us. Yeah, I was just joking earlier that you must be bored since there's nothing to do with either of those projects. So, thanks for being on with us today. If
Welcome.
if you're joining us on Zoom, please use the chat box to ask questions, or at the appropriate time, you can unmute yourself and you can join in the conversation. Also, if you're joining us through Facebook, I encourage you to also use the chat on Facebook, and we will bring in your comments into the conversation as we go. Thank you for joining us there. It's always nice to have participants on Facebook join us in the conversation. They're actually having 3 more of these learning labs this month. Every one of those will be on Thursday. Again, the focus this month is on violence reduction. On February 11th, we're doing a program called Raising Awareness and Shaping a New Narrative. We're going to be looking at the roles of art and media in reducing violence in our community. We'll have a great panel of Veda Morgan, who's at the Courier Journal, Kristen Pierce, who's at WHAS, and then we'll have 2 artists with us, Brian Warren and also Lance Newman, who is a poet and the director of the Young Poets of Louisville. So that'll be a great program. Again, that's next Thursday at 3 o'clock. And then on February 18th, we'll have another session called Who's Doing What? We'll have a panel conversation of organizational stakeholders that will be sharing some of their wisdom on what's happening in this space of violence reduction. The whole series will come to a crescendo at a community-wide summit called the Reckoning Forum, where we will highlight 3 or 4 individuals who are doing work in this area, but who are under-resourced. During the first part of the forum, participants will have a chance to hear the stories of these truth tellers and hear about their initiatives. In the second part of the forum, participants can join the individual who they feel most drawn to support in a smaller breakout group to cultivate a deeper connection and ask questions and learn how they can be of help. So please put Tuesday, February 23rd at 6 o'clock on your schedule and join us for our first Reckoning Forum. So let's get into our topic today and our conversation with Monique Williams. The purpose of today was to look at research that is happening in the area of violence reduction. What can we learn is working? What are the issues? And so Monique is uniquely positioned here in Louisville to help us in that conversation. So Monique, congratulations on your new appointment, and thanks for spending a little time with us today on our first Beloved Community Learning Lab. Let's start by just hearing a little bit of your story. Can you share a little bit about your story, how you got into this work?
Sure. So I guess Well, I'll just start with work background. So prior
Sure.
to my role at Ocean, I spent the last 6 years at the University of Louisville School of Public Health and Information Sciences, where I was recruited from Texas A&M University to assist with growing the community engaged research arm of the school, uh, which then turned into leading the National Center of Excellence in Youth Violence Prevention. We are one of 5 centers designated nationally from the CDC. Um, and yeah, we can talk more about that in a minute. But essentially, my background is in public health. I'm still associated with the university. I'm a professor at the School of Public Health and still very much so connected to the research happening at YPPRC, and that's the acronym for the Youth Violence Prevention Research Center. But more specifically, within public health, my areas of expertise are in violence prevention, racial equity, and community health development, which is essentially like community development, except for the goal or the outcome is improved health status for those that you're working with. So essentially, I'm a community engaged scholar and practitioner, and I've really just dedicated to improving health and well-being, particularly in marginalized neighborhoods, through community mobilization and action against violence.
That's great. Monique, can you share a little bit about how, what's the personal reasons you got into this work? Do you have some story behind that drives your passion for it?
I do. So, I mean, I think since I was little, I probably always wanted to improve the health and well-being for young people who grew up or are growing up in communities like the one that I grew up in, um, and just seeing how much, you know, violence interrupted the cycle of life. And while I couldn't have imagined it looking like this, um, that was my that was my kind of driving force. And so as I've grown up and learned to understand kind of how violence happens and the way in which they happen, um, my passions around addressing violence in the entirety of the spectrum, as I call it, from structural violence to interpersonal violence, has just become like a mission.
You're
I think
using
you're
you're
okay.
using some words there that I want to unpack a little bit. Talk about the difference between structural violence and then interpersonal violence a little bit. And what would you give as just a definition of violence in general?
So I think a pretty good definition, and I'd say I utilize this definition a lot because I don't necessarily think it has to change. I just think people have to recognize the entirety of the definition. So we use the World Health Organization definition a lot, and the definition of violence there is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in death, um, death, or psychological harm. And so it encompasses everything, right? But I think a lot of times people don't necessarily pay attention to all of what that definition means. And so the narrative around what violence is and how we should address it generally falls under one of two categories. And so people understand self-directed violence, and or interpersonal violence. And so self-directed violence refers to, violence in which a person hurts themselves. Interpersonal violence refers to violence between individuals and can be a lot of times subdivided into family and intimate partner violence, community violence. Uh, I mean, and that's where you're talking about things like child maltreatment or elder abuse. Um, maybe crime, somebody hurt somebody else in the street. And so these types of violence are easily seen, and there's generally a very clear perpetrator and a very clear victim. And so we have metrics and measures in research for days for those types of violence. And that's literally where the violence prevention world has lived for a very long time. But if we, really look at that definition, there are particular parts of it that we don't always think about when discussing violence. And so specifically, like I mentioned, that word power, and seeing violence as the use of power, threatened or actual, against another person or against a group or a community that ends in some type of morbidity or mortality. Um, and then I guess with this kind of violence, it's harder to kind of pick out because there's not necessarily one perpetrator or one victim, it's groups of people or institutions that are perpetrators, and there are groups of people that are victims. And so it's embedded in social, political, and economic systems, and it looks like the regular functioning of life. And so it's easy kind of not to see, and it's harder to call out. And so those are the things that we refer to as structural violence. So any scenario in which a social structure perpetuates any type of inequity that causes preventable suffering, that's structural violence. And so there's there are all kinds of linkages between how structural factors create the conditions for the interpersonal violence to happen. And again, a lot of times we start at the end of the spectrum where violence is already happening and we deal with the individual perpetrator or the individual victim, but we haven't done anything about the conditions that create the room for them to be in the place that they're in the first place. And so for me, I think it's critical that we have to address violence in the entirety of its definition, which includes also addressing structural issues that impact individuals who are easily seen as people who are committing violent acts.
Yeah, and I think that I really appreciate that definition, that it's not just the act of it, it's the threat or the fear that goes along with that in and of itself can be violent towards people. So it's a structure that threatens people. Let's get a little more practical with that definition. So what would be a structural element of violence? And let's get even more particular to Louisville. What would be a structural element in that's creating violence in Louisville specifically?
So an example that we use a lot, which it's easier seen when it's depicted, but I'll kind of walk through it. Something that's recognized in the city right now would be something like redlining. Excuse me. And so the structural violence would be, we can talk about racism as we declare racism a public health issue. And then the policies and practices that maintain the oppression from racism in something like redlining, right? And so then community conditions that are at increased risk of violence are redline communities, because now you've created this concentrated poverty in these spaces, right? And so now at the family level or the community level, you have conditions that increase risk of violence because there is now resource deprivation amongst those who are existing in this concentrated poverty. And so then and this is me going according to social ecology within public health, but where we like to first focus is on this interpersonal level. And so now looking at the interpersonal conditions that increase risk of violence, you have a sense of competition that is now created from resource deprivation, from concentrated poverty created by redlining, right? And so now you have at the individual level, when you're looking at characteristics of people who are engaging in violent behavior, you can look at survival and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when people are trying to survive, a lot of times it's by any means necessary. So you put people in survival mode by creating a place of competition because of the lack of resources available, because of the concentrated poverty, because of the redlining that was created. And so where have we done anything to address what has happened at the root of it all? And so you're going to continue to produce and increase the likelihood of violence happening in the ways that it's happening in these communities, because we have not addressed all of the things that happen to create this place in the first place. And so that's a clear example here in Louisville where people can kind of connect with that. And that's just one
Yeah,
example.
right. Yeah, and that's helpful. Talk some about specifically about the research that you were doing at U of L. Like, what were you measuring? What did that research look like? What were your research questions? What were you measuring? And then, what are some highlights from that? What did you find out, or what are you finding out?
So when I mentioned earlier that, in the world of research, we have kind of research to death at the individual and interpersonal level. And so the CDC was really looking to not necessarily fund programs. They actually wouldn't let us do any programming, but they were looking to fund community and or policy level strategies for violence prevention. And so for us, even before we got the designation, we had done research in the community over the last almost 2 years prior to the designation, just around community safety, and violence and hope and justice. There are several projects that we had done prior to, but the consensus was like, yeah, violence is happening. Everybody is concerned about it, but like nobody is doing anything about the things that we need to help stop it, right? Like we are under resourced. We don't have anything for our young people to do. There are not jobs in our community, and then there's not equitable access to be able to get to the spaces where the jobs are. We don't have the reliable transportation, and so all of these issues that are kind of underlying people's ability to make better choices and make better decisions. Community is kind of raging with all of the reasons why certain things are happening, but nobody is, or they feel like nobody is listening to that. And so in partnership with a lot of community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and specifically youth in the community, because that was our focus, we came up with the community level strategy of a social norming campaign where we were looking to change the norms of violence in the community. And so, which is a collective work. And so essentially social norms, obviously they significantly influence an individual's beliefs and attitudes, and then those beliefs and attitudes dictate their choices and their behavior. And so essentially their expectations and kind of inexplicit rules, and so the normal and typical behaviors that a person feels like they have to follow to be accepted by the people around them. And so, a person's behavior is not just based on, oh, I want to do this today. A lot of times it has a significant amount to do with what they believe is expected of them and what they believe is expected of them by the people that are around them. And so, initially it may have started as us wanting to kind of debunk some of the myths that young people held about violence and the ways in which it was happening. But then also what community wanted to elevate were the myths about what it meant to exist in their spaces and the myths about why the violence was happening to their communities in the ways that it was happening. And so here we have a lot of data around the inequities, and we had a lot of quantitative data. And so when we first got here, we did a lot of qualitative work to help explain those quantitative numbers. And when you talk to people in the community, they're talking about inequity. They're talking about feeling oppressed. They're talking about discrimination. They're talking about the prejudice that exists when they are trying to do things that people are saying, you should just go get a job, or you should just go and do this. And so it's like, well, how can we specifically highlight this part of what is causing violence and the violence that is being experienced by communities, like not just the violence that is outwardly happening, but the violence that's happening against them. That is what they wanted to elevate. And so we built a campaign with community, particularly with young people, around structural violence in the community. So this was a youth violence prevention research center. So obviously we were focused on young people. And so the campaign strategy essentially was to influence the norms of the city through a 3-year social norming campaign, and it sought to cultivate positive racial identity for young people because we know at the interpersonal level, positive racial identity, socio-political development, and kind of critical consciousness development are protective factors against violence for youth of color. And so we wanted to elevate those strategies here locally. And so we were cultivating positive racial identity and fostering community dialogue around difficult issues such as racial and social injustice. And in doing so, the hope was to raise critical consciousness and to catalyze social action in an effort to promote equitable policies and practices in the community and reduce youth violence. Because again, it has to be an everybody kind of work, which incorporates systems and organizations, and not just telling young people to not harm each other when there are all kinds of things that impact their ability to make that decision. And so I'd say, Lord, there's a whole technical report that we have of findings, but let's see if I can remember some of the big ones. Youth living in structurally marginalized neighborhoods endure a great deal of structural violence and its effects, such as poverty, dehumanization, the societal depictions of their community, and then exposure to community violence and police violence against the community. Young people living up to or talking about living up to the expectations of what others say about who they are. And so the narrative is important. And a lot of times them having particular experiences in their community, but then everything outside of the community, especially what they see on the news and in other spaces, has all of these negative things to say about who they are. It impacts a motivation level. It's why do I need to do anything different? Or this is the assumption about who we are. Like maybe this is who we are, so there's all this internal struggle that a lot of the young people were dealing with as it related to narrative and things that were happening within their community. Another big one is that were you saying something?
Well, I was going to ask, there's been a lot of talk as we're looking at violence reduction methods. A lot of talk about defunding the police and putting those resources into social service. What, as far as research goes, other communities, what are other communities doing, or what have we found helpful in Louisville? And do you think that moving resources from the police department to social service is one of those ways that would be helpful and effective policy?
I think that moving resources into community-driven safety strategies is a necessity. Once you get to law enforcement, and there's a place, for law enforcement, in public health, when we talk about violence prevention, it's kind of primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention. And primary intervention is where, you're creating space for violence not to happen at all. Like you're getting in front of it before it happens. For me, I explain that as equity, period. When everybody's basic needs are being met, like the likelihood of violence in ways that we're seeing it is significantly dropped. Secondary prevention is more so intervention, and where you can see some law enforcement because some violence has happened and now we have to respond to it. And so that's where a lot of violence intervention strategies, like when you look in research at the community level, there are probably 4 top strategies for community level violence prevention or intervention. And those are focused deterrence, when you're focusing specifically on individuals who have been identified as like shooters or potential shooters, and specifically to gun violence, and engaging with them specifically to alter, their decision making as it pertains to engaging in violence, and then trying to provide them with the necessary resources to make different decisions. There is the pure violence model, which acts very much so like public health, where you are essentially employing contact tracers to interrupt transmission of violence in the community. And that, yeah, that has in research, probably those two are probably the top two, but you see significant decreases with that kind of a model. Then you have hospital-based violence intervention programs, and we have that in the city, where after there's a gunshot or a victim of gun violence and they are in the hospital, then they are met in the hospital with resources and assistance and case management to decrease the likelihood of re-injury and to decrease the likelihood of retaliation, because a lot of times those kinds of decisions are made in that place. And then there is, well, the most notable fellowship, which people call it different things in different places, but it's like a peacemaker fellowship, which was similar to the Thrive Fellowship that was here at the city, where you are employing individuals who have been incarcerated previously, or who have, violent histories, and you're engaging them in a process of helping them become what would be considered like a positive individual who is contributing to society. And so those strategies for intervention also work. And then at the tertiary level too, it's just, that's where the restorative practices happen. That's when you need rehabilitation and when things have already happened and you're trying to restore an individual. And so we would like to live in primary prevention, but unfortunately, we're having to live in tertiary prevention because we don't necessarily have the foundation for primary prevention. And so if we're talking about what other cities are doing or what other spaces are doing, they have some form of one of those four models, if not all four, as an intervention strategy. But they also, specifically in cities that have offices for violence prevention, or office like this city has, they focus on funding organizations that do prevention work and focusing those resources mainly on young people, because we know within this research you have a better chance for long-term impact when you start in adolescence.
Yeah. Can you share the 155 homicides and then the 550? Do you have some more data on specifically this last year? And I know we throw out that data, which is part of buying into this narrative that we don't look at. I mean, we're actually looking at interpersonal violence and we're not asking questions about the structural violence that caused that. And I want to get back to that and specifically ask you about the intersection of racism and how that actually creates violence. But do you have any more information about what about that violence that we're naming and is getting all the media attention?
I mean, I guess in what regards? Last year was obviously an unprecedented year. Last year wasn't a normal year. And I think that it highlighted, just how much violence is a public health issue. We had a significant spike, right? And so we have, young people not able to engage in the general spaces that are considered safe spaces for them. Schools are closed, community centers are closed, extracurricular activities are down. And so there are a lot of young people with a lot of hands on their time to be able to do some things that they may not otherwise do or engage in. You had a lot of, and still have a lot of, economic instability thanks to the pandemic. And so people are being pushed to do some things to, again, survive. I think we're just seeing on a larger scale, what was already happening, and probably in more places than we would normally see it, just because these things are real factors that increase risk of violence. And then you also had, civil unrest. And so people at a point of contention with law enforcement. And so then you're looking at how law enforcement is engaging and whether or not they can even engage in some of these instances, and then whether or not they want to. There was a lot that happened in last year that uncovered multiple opportunities for violence to be rampant in the ways in which it is right now. And so some of it, as we get back to some sense of normalcy, will be abated, but then there's some of it again that will continue and that exists because of all of the other things that I've already discussed.
Yeah. And I know there's been some money given, and there's can you share more about the group violence intervention program that I know is being talked about and being launched? We're going to actually have on the 18th some representatives talking about that model. But can you give us a little taste of what that model is so we can be aware of it?
Yes, so that model would be considered the focus deterrent. And so that is the identifying through law enforcement intel individuals who are shooters or potential shooters. So people who have been identified as in imminent danger of perpetuating violence or violence may be perpetuated against them. And it's in a group setting, right? So they're looking at gang and or group activity because generally we know, like, groups go back and forth. A lot of the violence is between some of the same people. And so how can you engage within those networks to get them to stop shooting? And so once individuals are identified, they are then contacted, and the idea is to connect with them. And there's a message that's essentially like, hey, you're on law enforcement radar. It's something you need to know. We want you to be safe. We want to keep you alive. We want to help you in whatever way that we can. But I mean, at the end of the day, you have to stop the violence. And so there are social services and community support at the table to try to address whatever the needs may be of the individual that is engaged. Like, what is it that they need to be able to make different decisions? How can we support them in not engaging in the ways they've been engaged, potentially harm somebody, or for them to potentially harm? And if they choose to continue, or if they are a part of a shooting afterwards, then that's law enforcement engagement at that point.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel ambiguous about bringing it up too much because it feels like it points the narrative back to that old narrative, so I want to help change the narrative in this conversation, and that's exactly why next week we're having some media folks on there to what's their responsibility in changing this narrative, because the group intervention I've looked at it a little bit, and it seems helpful in one form of stopping violence, but it doesn't focus on that larger. It again says, oh, it's this group of people that are causing the violence. And so let's get back to the other narrative around racism. Can you talk about the intersection of racism and how racism creates environments that promote violence or is violent in and of itself?
So both of what you just said, right? Like, racism in and of itself is a violent act. It is structurally violent against people. It keeps people from meeting the basic needs. It keeps people from achieving what even the societal standard of America says they're supposed to be able to achieve. There are all of these barriers that are placed just based on the color of someone's skin. And so if we know that, protective factors are things like education, are gainful employment, are opportunities and access to, healthcare and services. And we know that racism has historically marginalized people from equitable access to these spaces. It's just like we've created, and people don't really want to talk about it or address it because it causes you to have to change. It causes us to have to change our mindset about what we believe about people and what they do. A lot of times we have a pretty autonomous way of looking at things. Like, individuals have individual autonomy. People make choices. But if you are making a choice to survive, and that choice to survive requires that you harm another person, if it's me or you, for any person, it's going to be me that I choose over you, and so we have a lot of community here that are set up in that way. And not enough resources within the spaces that they can get to be able to make different decisions. So how are we supporting them, not demonizing and criminalizing people because we're swift with our punitive action? But how are we trying to ensure that people have what they need to be able to make better decisions?
Well, and thank you for that. And I think let's continue to point out that narrative change that needs to happen. We've got really some sharp people on Zoom. Would love if you're on Zoom and have a question or a comment, let's have some conversation. Also, if you're joining us on Facebook, please put a comment or a question in and let's engage the conversation. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question or make a comment.
Thank you, Judd. This is Raju in Boulder, Colorado, with Global Mediation. I have a question about how do we change the mindset around a zero-sum game where everybody's feeling like we have so many limited resources. We had a tax cut that cost over $2 trillion. And we're debating about the same amount to help the large population of the United States. Why do we focus so exclusively, or why are we having a difficult time understanding that a tax cut that helps a very few people as opposed to passing bills that help a wide variety of people? And this goes back to the mindset of violence. You know, there are people who feel that they are protected from the violence because of the amount of money they make and the amount of protection and security they can have. Violence is affecting the mass number of people. And so we're having these conversations, but it seems like we're spending a lot of energy on the why as opposed to focusing on how do we move forward with the resources that we have to help our communities.
Yeah, Raju, I appreciate that. And I think that's the changing of the narrative, right? I think that's where we have to refocus the narrative in order to engage that. I don't know if Monique, you have a comment about that. There's also a question from Ruth Ann who asked, how does restorative justice work or not work to address interpersonal violence? And if you could share some about the restorative justice model, that would be helpful as well. Monique, do you want to?
I mean, yeah, so I think it depends on, how the restorative justice model is set up, and it looks different in a lot of spaces. I can't speak too much to ours here. I haven't really gotten into that as of yet. I know that's one of the places that we fund from Ocean is our Restorative Justice Louisville. But I think, if there aren't the right partnerships or agreements in place with, the courts and different things like that, you kind of lose leverage in even getting the people into the program, which I think I've heard is an issue here. If there's no kind of even incentive for somebody to engage in a restorative justice process. So, I don't want to speak too much about what happens here or misspeak on the restorative justice aspect of the work that's done here. But I do know one of the limitations has been on like getting people into the actual program.
Mm-hmm. And Ruth Ann, I don't want to, again, overcomment as well. The restorative justice process, I think, is not enacted if there's been an act of violence against another person. So it has to be more like a misdemeanor, or it has to be a different kind of violation. If it's a violent act towards someone, I don't believe it's allowed to go into the restorative justice process. At least that's my understanding of the restorative justice work in Louisville. How about some other questions or comments from folks? Feel free to unmute yourself and let's continue the conversation.
Hey, Jed, this is Al. I'm just wondering which city in the United States is really has nailed it so far, or who would be a good role model, or how do we kind of compare with other cities?
Yeah, good question. Monique, can you reflect on that?
Yes, I'll say that as a city, we're pretty behind in our intervention strategies, and we're behind because there hasn't been a lot of kind of concentrated or strategic effort in putting funds into prevention work. I know we have one of the smallest budgets in a violence prevention office from our peer cities and cities around the country. And so if I had to give a gold standard for a city who does amazing work, I'd have to say Oakland. They have an amazing violence reduction system that has been in operation for several years now, but also they have established as a city a tax that puts money directly into the office that does violence prevention. And then there's this fund to kind of facilitate resources into the community. And I mean, that budget is like $22, $26 million, but just specific to their intervention strategies, where I'm talking about like open deterrence and engaging people who are at highest risk for violence, just that specific budget alone is like $8 million. And so, you know, at Ocean, we have like $1 million. So there's a lot of work that could be done and that needs to be done, but we have to, as a city, kind of come to a point of, okay, like violence is something that we are going to be intolerable of across the spectrum. And these are the resources that we're putting into violence prevention. And, you know, we can go from there. But there are several cities who are doing an excellent job. And so I would say Oakland and then Minneapolis too, they have some amazing work.
And I think that's an important narrative, Monique, because Louisville loves to compare itself to other cities. And so, you know, I think if we can play that game, which I'm not a huge fan of, but use that as a leverage to talk about what are the resources we're giving in comparison to other cities that are doing a good job. I think that's a good issue for us to push. Joppa, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, this is Joppa. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate how Monique, you all are not just focusing on the mitigation of interpersonal violence when you work with youth, but really educating them about how structural violence is influencing their behavior and how they can become a part of that change. I think those individuals becoming a part of addressing the structural violence that is influencing them is a way that the narrative really will change. They would change the narrative, and they will be political forces in the future that will get policies looked at and maybe addressing these issues differently. So I'm really glad that that's something that you all recognize in the work that you're doing with young people. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a critical part of the work.
And Monique, you used some words earlier that if you could go back to, you talked about these, there are some predictive positive things that we know that if we provide, that reduces violence. Can you speak a little bit more about these positive qualities that we can cultivate, or resources that are available instead of looking at the negative? What are those positive resources? And you used a word for it. Was it protective?
Protective factors?
Protective factors. Yeah. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yes. So whether you're looking at the individual level or the interpersonal level or community level, there are differing risks and protective factors for violence. And depending on the kind of violence you're looking at, like everybody has kind of its own subset of risk and protective factors, but there are common risk and protective factors. And we know that if we are kind of addressing violence according to those common risk factors and protective factors, that we can hit a whole host of different kinds of violence if we just address those kinds of things. And so again, focusing at the community level, some of those risk factors are like if there's history of victimization, exposure to violence, poverty, limited social, educational, and economic opportunities, racism-related stress, all of the kinds of things. But if you look at protective factors, you're looking at social connectedness and social cohesion, stable connections to caring adults for young people, and even for older people. Sometimes we're finding out that just a caring person next to them to walk through life with kind of help, because a lot of these individuals are traumatized. And so trauma is begetting more trauma. So just any type of tie to post-social relationships or positive relationships and having positive connections to community, social norms that promote post-social behavior, which again is on the how are we thinking about things and surrounding ourselves with people who are thinking about things in the ways that we're thinking about things, but also we're getting the truth about what is actually happening, so that we're not responding just kind of based on a narrative that's false. And then ensuring that people have access to social, economic, and educational opportunities, and then access to supportive services, supportive resources and services. And so at a community level, those are some of the protective factors. But when you look at the interpersonal level, some of the stuff that I was talking about, like positive racial identity for youth of color, again, them being connected to caring adults, building skills and knowledge base in young people is a protective factor for violence, and then them being engaged in organized activities of some sort are also positive protective factors.
Yeah, thank you. Ruth Ann and Jim, do you want to unmute yourself and make your comment or your question? You've got it in the chat box, and I'm happy to read it there, but if you'd like to make that comment, feel free.
Well, I've just been continuing to think about the possible structural forms of violence that are here in the city. And Monique, you mentioned redlining, but that officially has been, discontinued. And so I'm thinking of the ways that it does still continue. And I was wondering if our zoning laws are still enabling the redlining effort to go forward. So I was just wondering about those kind of things. And in addition to that, when you think about zoning, you think about neighborhoods, you think about locations. And does Louisville have a force at work that is keeping people stuffed into higher risk neighborhoods instead of having systems in place that enable us to be a compassionate community by extending? I know it's a whole lot. That's why I put it in the chat, because I know I talk too much.
No, those are great questions. Thank you. Monique?
So yeah, I mean, we're dealing with the effect of redlining, right? And so when you think about zoning laws and zoning policies, like those are things, and people aren't kind of civically engaged and pressing on those things, or even have the knowledge of how those things are impacting them, you kind of stay the same. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that, as a city, there is a mechanism like keeping people at a place, but these are places where people already exist. And so, why should they have to leave a particular zip code to go to another zip code for opportunity? Like, there should just be equitable opportunity. And so what is happening in some communities that are not happening in other communities is the larger question. And so an easy example for me is like, let's say we're talking about diabetes, which, like, where are you coming from with that? But you know, there's a lot of data that shows like, oh, people in, the West End are not as healthy, and like diabetes is an issue. So maybe we need to get some diabetes management programs happening over there. But when you talk to the community, it's more so access to healthy food and access to even just a grocery store. So you have people that are living in food deserts who have access to like a KFC and a McDonald's and a fast food place, like it's on every corner. So it's like, why is it that can be on every corner, but we can't find a grocery store? And you look at some zoning laws and policies that allow for certain things to be, but people don't know to push against that or where to even begin on the political front of addressing things like zoning laws, which is why socio-political development is not just important for young people, it's also important for older people in the community so that community can mobilize and organize and solidify one voice to speak to some of the things that you're talking about. I think it's just, it's residue of what has been. And so it's more of the same that will continue until, people are educated enough to even know that certain things are happening in their spaces that are detrimental to them.
Thank you, Monique. And we've got just a few minutes left. So my question, if you were to invite Louisville to those on this call and listening into a few key actions, a few fulcrum points where we can put some energy that are going to have, what would you recommend? What would be the 2 or 3 things that you would really say, let's focus as a community? Maybe these are some places where Ocean is focusing. How can we join you in that?
So yes, in one way, I think there has to be an understanding of just how much violence affects everybody and bringing that narrative to the table. Like, even if you're not in a community that seems to be extremely affected by, homicides, it's that language is out there and it's always there, right? But people don't even recognize that the suicide rate in the city normally is almost just as bad as the homicide rate. But the suicide rate doesn't look like it looks in the West End. The suicide rate is high in the East End. Or the drug overdoses, is high in the East End. And so just this narrative about violence overall impacting all of us, even, the cost of violence, and we're all paying for that as taxpayers. And so that conversation, just last year, I think it cost us $130 million for the 170 something homicides that happened. Whether you're talking about the response to the crime scene and the investigation costs and the hospital costs and loss of revenue and all of the gains, when there are things that we can do on the preventative side to not get us to have to pay, those kind of costs. So helping to broaden the narrative and the understanding of what violence is, how it's happening, and how it impacts everybody is something that we're going to begin to work on. And as much community input and sharing and advocacy as we can get around that will be helpful. What else are we doing? There's a lot that we're trying to do. I call it the mini mighty team because there's not many of us in this office. But another thing that we're attempting to do is, again, funnel resources into the communities that are mostly affected by this. And so whether that is averting funds from one place to another, needing to be able to put more funds into prevention work, and elevating that part of the conversation as well. And understanding that it takes everybody. So where do you sit? And there's going to be like a specific document that kind of delineates how you can kind of be the one to make a difference, how you can engage, whether you are in the business sector, whether you are, a community-based organization, or whether you are just an interested individual. Our Ambassador Institute is a good place to also start. So connect with us, and the things that we're attempting to do. And I'm still kind of building out some of these strategies, but there will be that information, I'd
Great.
say in the next few months
Yeah.
as it's coming together.
Well, and also want to encourage, especially white people, to really look at that narrative. I think it's important, and for us to come to terms with our own white supremacy and whiteness culture that really is perpetuating the violence. I think that narrative really needs to be shifted. This isn't a Black thing or a person of color thing or a West Louisville thing. As you were saying, Monique, it's a white power and privilege that we're unconscious of and that we continue to propagate for ourselves is violent towards people, and it's violent towards ourselves. And so I think that's also a narrative that we really need to take a look at as we enter into this conversation. I want to continue to reinforce that, so it doesn't look like, oh, well, we have to fix West Louisville, or we've got to fix this group of people, because I really think that's a form of violence, actually. Monique, I'm so appreciative of your wisdom, the work that you're doing. What a gift you are for our community. And know that we are with you and we support you. And together as the beloved community, we're going to join you, and we're going to take responsibility for ourselves. And we're also going to uplift the beautiful work that's happening in our community. So thank you. And as you start this new adventure, know that we're all behind you and we're with you. And we're deeply grateful for the work that you're doing. Thanks for being with us today. And do you have any final thoughts or words before we finish?
I mean, I'm just excited about the work. It's hard work, but it's passion work. So, there's motivation there behind just, work and a job. Like, I'd probably be doing this if I wasn't getting paid, because it's significant and it's important. So I'm just appreciative of you all and the support. We are building out a faith-based strategy too. So I may be, reaching out as we develop that out and see what connections can be made there, which will be another opportunity, for engagement. But just looking forward to, working with y'all.
Beautiful. And we look forward to that as well. For all of you that have joined us on Zoom, thanks for being here. If you've joined us on Facebook, we had a good Facebook group. Thank you all for joining us as well. And I want to invite you back next week where we're going to be looking at narrative change, specifically how artists have an ability to change narratives, but also media's responsibility, and representatives from the Courier Journal and also WHAS will be talking about their responsibility to help change these narratives about a violent community. If you want to unmute yourself, those that have joined us on Zoom, you're welcome to say words of thanks to Monique and say goodbye to each other. I appreciate you all being here. Peace.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Monique.
Monique. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique, and thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Monique.
Thank you. Good to have you all here. Deborah, good to have you here. Thank you for being on. Raju, thank you for joining us all the way from Colorado. Good to have you. Thank you, Monique. You all be well.
you.
Blessings. We'll stay in touch.